Welcome to the 19th video on ancient Rome. In the last several videos, we dealt with the Roman victory over the Samnites in the Samnite Wars. And that wasn't just a victory over the Samnites, it was a victory over several tribes in Italy. And what's even more remarkable about that was the fact that many of the tribes in Italy were divided culturally and linguistically, but slowly and methodically they were absorbed by the Romans. And it was that Roman military machine that was absolutely unyielding. And it was because of the political and military changes that they made that allowed it to achieve total victory. So by the time the Pyrrhic Wars began, Rome had pretty much pushed the Gauls past the Po River in the north, and in the south, Rome began to make new progress. And they did that through colonization, and that began to draw the attention of the Greeks, especially the city of Tarentum. And so 10 years after the Samnite Wars, the Pyrrhic Wars began. And they were led by Pyrrhus, who you can see right here in this image. And we'll be talking about him in a couple minutes. And of course, this would be the first time that the legion would go head-to-head with the phalanx. And it wasn't just the phalanx they were going up against. They were going up against the famed Macedonian phalanx. And so this was a remarkable moment in the history of military warfare. Now, as I previously mentioned, Rome began to push south, and they wanted control of the entire Italian peninsula. And that meant taking control of the numerous Greek cities in the south. Now, Rome established colonies in Apulia and Lucania, and they also entered into several Greek cities in the south. And they were able to do that because the Greeks were not unified. What a shock, right? If you watched my series on ancient Greece, there always seemed to be some division between the Greeks. And these differences involved the typical dispute between the Democrats and the aristocratic factions. Rome came to the assistance of the aristocratic factions. The Democrats opposed Rome. Now, the main city that favored the Democrats was Tarentum. So Tarentum began to fear the Roman growth in the south. And so Rome was really able to exploit these differences by siding with the aristocrats. Had the Greeks been unified, maybe they would have been able to deal with Rome. But they were deeply divided, as they always were. And of course, as we talked about in previous videos, Rome was 100% unified in taking over all of Italy. Now, what happened was in 282 BC, Pyrrhi, which you can see right here on the map, was controlled by aristocrats. And they had a dispute with another city. They asked Rome for help, and Rome obliged by sending a fleet into the Gulf of Taranto. But that violated an existing treaty that Rome had with Tarentum that basically said no ships in that bay, period, end of story. Well, Tarentum attacked the Roman fleet, sinking several Roman ships. Rome was outraged over this and demanded reparations from Tarentum, but were refused, and so Rome declared war on Tarentum. And that's probably what Rome wanted all along anyways, because they wanted to seek a decisive defeat against Tarentum, and with a victory they would have controlled all of southern Italy. Meanwhile, Pyrrhi revolted and was replaced by Democrats loyal to Tarentum. So the Romans dispatched a consular army to Tarentum. And in the first year, they spent most of their time plundering the territory around Tarentum. And that occurred in 281 BC. And then the Roman army simply withdrew. Now, Tarentum knew they couldn't take on Rome alone. And so they turned to the leading Greek general of the day, Pyrrhus. Now, Pyrrhus was born a few years after Alexander the Great, and he was one of those generals/kings that had fought over Alexander's empire. And Alexander's empire, after his death, had been carved into separate entities, and that has been since called Hellenistic Greece. And I will cover that extensively in my Ancient Greek series, because Pyrrhus was really an amazing individual. And he literally was all over the map, going everywhere and anywhere where there might be a battle. So he was rather interesting, and I will cover him again very extensively in my Ancient Greek series. But this is a series on Rome, so we are interested in his dealings with Rome. Now, he took over a region in Greece called Epirus, and you can see that on the map right there. Now, Pyrrhus made this kingdom the most powerful in ancient Greece during his time. And as I said, he was one of the best generals of the day. So he was very much a threat to Rome. Now, Pyrrhus saw himself in the same mold as Alexander. Alexander had carved his empire out east, and Pyrrhus wanted to carve his empire out west. And he wanted to use Italy as his springboard for future operations. So first he wanted to help Tarentum because they were a close ally of his. And actually Tarentum had helped him conquer Corcyra, so he felt obligated to help Tarentum. And his plan plan, of course, was to stir up some of Rome's long-term enemies and use them as his allies, especially the Samnites. And so after he defeated Rome in Italy, he would then move on to Sicily and then even Carthage. And after that, he would lead his armies in an attack on Macedon, which was the crown jewel of the Greek Empire. So that actually was his overall objective. So his plans were very, very ambitious. And of course, there was a lot of risk with this overall plan. Pyrrhus has often been called a gambler and even referred to as an adventurer. So maybe he was just the type of guy to pull it off, because he had that same burning ambition that Alexander the Great had. Now, how seriously did Pyrrhus take Rome? Well, we have to remember that the Romans had been a local concern in Italy, but the Greeks had been all over the world. So maybe Pyrrhus was a little bit overconfident and underestimated Rome, but that was no different than Carthage. Carthage actually sided with Rome during the Pyrrhic Wars, because they viewed Pyrrhus as the major threat, not Rome. But again, it makes sense because Rome had really only been confined to Italy, so they were pretty much an unknown. They wouldn't be for much longer, though, as Pyrrhus was about to find out. Now, before the invasion of Italy, Pyrrhus made peace with several of the other Greek territories, and then he recruited an army to fight in Italy. And he landed in Italy at Tarentum in 280 BC, and you can see that on the map right here. Now, Rome took this threat very seriously, and they mobilized 8 legions to deal with Pyrrhus. They were divided into 4 armies totaling about 80,000 men. 2 armies were dispatched to keep the Italian tribes in line. Another army was left to protect Rome, and the 4th army, under the command of Publius Valerius Lavinus, marched towards Tarentum. And this set up the first major engagement of the Pyrrhic Wars, the Battle of Heraclea. But before we get to the Battle of Heraclea, we should talk about the war elephants that Pyrrhus brought with him. Now, war elephants were the ultimate weapon. They could trample on an enemy, and usually there was a platform on top of the elephant that could hold a crew of 4. And this crew could fire missiles or arrows down on an enemy. So height was always an advantage with elephants. But really, war elephants were the ultimate terror weapon. And the idea here is to put the fear into the enemy with the hope that the mere sight of these elephants would cause the enemy to flee and they would break rank and run from the battlefield. Now, Pyrrhus used Indian war elephants. Hannibal used African war elephants. So there were 2 different species that Rome had to face. Now, one big disadvantage of the elephant was that it could really only go in one direction. And so they were not very maneuverable. The other major problem was that elephants made no distinction between friend and foe. So if the handler lost control of the elephant, it could do severe damage to your own troops. Now, elephants actually have been used for a long time, right up until the 19th century, until the heavy cannon made them obsolete. Okay, so let's take a look at the Battle of Heraclea. And so if you take a look at that, you can see those 20 to 25 Indian war elephants that Pyrrhus brought along with him. And those will play a key role in the battle to come. Now, you can see that these armies were roughly the same size. And if you take a look at the Roman troops, about half of their army is composed of allied soldiers. And that is something we talked about, of course, in previous videos. Rome started requesting her allies to supply troops. And what they did here was they actually lowered the taxes on some of these cities, because the main thing Rome wanted control of was their troops, and for them to supply troops when Rome went to war. And so that greatly boosted the size of the Roman armies. And it was somewhat beneficial to Rome's allies, because they were allowed to share in the war booty with Rome. And so this made some of Rome's allies very, very wealthy when these troops came home with some of the war booty. Okay, so let's take a look at the battle itself. But before we do that, I want to pay special thanks to Robbie House. He put these wonderful maps together for this video. And Robbie is an expert in ancient warfare, so if you have any questions, I'm sure he would be more than happy to answer them for you. Now, Pyrrhus took up a position near the river Pyrrhus, and this was advantageous because it was on a plain. And of course, that was beneficial to the Greek phalanx. And there he waited for the Romans. Now, he tried to negotiate with the Romans, but the Romans would not negotiate with Pyrrhus at all. They basically wanted him out of Italy completely. Now, Pyrrhus set up some initial light infantry near the river to do 2 things. First, to let him know when the Romans began to cross, and also to try to block the Romans from crossing the river. Now, at dawn, the Romans began to cross the river Pyrrhus, and they were actually able to cross the river farther down from the light troops that Pyrrhus had sent to block the bridge. And so they were able to launch an attack against the Greek light infantry, and they were forced to flee. Now, Pyrrhus watched the Romans cross the river, and he was amazed by what he saw. He saw an unbelievable amount of discipline and organization, and he realized that this would be no simple foe. Now, he sent some forward units to disrupt the Roman battle formations, and this was some cavalry and some peltasts, and they actually were able to successfully do just that. They disrupted the Roman battle formations and then withdrew again. And this bought Pyrrhus some critical time to set up his formations before the Roman legions could attack. And then both sides set up in their respective formations. And so this would be a massive clash between the phalanx and the Roman legion. And the infantry engagement was a bitter struggle. There were 7 individual efforts from Pyrrhus to break the Roman legions he faced, and each one was repulsed. The Romans, for their part, also launched 7 individual attacks as well, and they were repulsed. So the battle hung in the balance. But then the Greeks suffered a setback as the Roman cavalry began to rout the right flank of Pyrrhus. And so there was mortal danger on that right flank. With the Greeks actually in danger of losing the battle, Pyrrhus deployed his secret weapon, the Indian war elephants, and they ripped into the Roman lines. And this was an absolute nightmare for the Romans. The Roman horses probably had never seen anything like this and simply galloped away off the battlefield. And with that, the Roman heavy infantry fled as well. And so Pyrrhus was able to claim victory on the battlefield. Now, Dionysius indicates that the Romans lost around 15,000 soldiers, with roughly half of those taken prisoner and the other half killed in combat. He put the Greek losses at around 11,000 soldiers. Now, this is the first of the Pyrrhic victories, and this is a term that you'll hear even today. And we'll talk about that in the next video quite a bit. But basically what that means is Pyrrhus won the battle, but he was losing the war because the Romans could replace all of the soldiers they lost. Pyrrhus could not. So he really could not afford to lose thousands of soldiers in any battle. He had to have decisive victories. And so one thing was apparent after this first battle, and that is the Romans could not only stand up to the Greek phalanx, they could also inflict severe casualties against the Greeks. Now, after that battle, Pyrrhus did receive some reinforcements from southern Italy, but again, he faced a much larger enemy in the Romans. Now, Lavinus retreated north and received 2 more legions, so he basically was able to bring his army right back to battle strength. Now, one thing that amazed Pyrrhus was the loyalty of the Roman soldiers. He tried to convince the captured Roman soldiers to switch sides, but all of the Roman soldiers refused. So this made it quite clear to Pyrrhus that he was not dealing with mercenaries here. He was dealing with very loyal citizen soldiers. Now, after this, Pyrrhus had the momentum. He headed north, capturing town after town in Campania, and then he plundered Latium. And he actually moved to within 30 miles of the capital, Rome. And there he tried to negotiate with the Romans. But once again, the Romans refused to talk to Pyrrhus about any potential truce or peace. Now, Pyrrhus had to call off his attack on Rome because the consular armies were still at large in Italy, and they were heading to Rome. So in order to avoid a trap, he had to retreat further south, and that set up yet another battle, which we will get to in the next video.